Hi, I'm Andrew Francis. We're going to continue looking at the Trinitarian implications from Matthew chapter 1, verse 18 to 25 for God's people, the church. Not only does the Trinitarian nature of the church point to a Christ-like need for self-giving, but it also points to the communal nature of the people of God. As Harper and Metzger affirm, the church is a Trinitarian community. Because the Trinity is the basis of the church's identity and very nature, the church itself is communal and relational. This understanding of the Trinitarian and communal nature of the church is of even more or greater imperative in a world where a loss of community, isolation and loneliness now are found at epidemic proportion. In the United Kingdom, a minister for loneliness was appointed after a recent report citing that of the 66 million residents, 9 million people report often or always feeling lonely. Whilst another study showed that 200,000 elderly people had not had a conversation with a friend or relative in over a month. Mother Teresa poignantly asserts tuberculosis and cancer are not the great diseases. I think a much greater disease is to be unwanted, unloved. My own experience of spending time in a gay bar has brought me in contact with so many who readily claim me as their best friend after a few conversations or visits, not because of my great ability at developing relationships, but as an indicator of the complete lack of relationships in their lives. I remember a former male prostitute and long-term drug user explaining to me he'd been seriously considering suicide on the night he met me in the bar. He explained how during our conversation he sensed hope return. He became a regular at our fortnightly Bible studies and was particularly pleased to join our house church for Christmas. Previously in this thesis, I also spoke of the importance for human beings to understand themselves as part of a story. Not only is it important to understand our own individual story, but to understand ourselves within the context of a larger communal story. It's not surprising, therefore, as human beings who have been created in the image of the triune God, as in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 27, that to thrive and to truly become all we are created to be, that we do so in relationship with others. As John Zizioulas points out, true being comes only from the free person, from the person who loves freely, that is, who freely affirms his being, his identity, by means of an event of communion with other persons. Of course, Zizioulas' understanding of the Trinity as hierarchical provides him with the basis for an hierarchical understanding of the church. And whilst he argues that the hierarchy and authority found within the church are born out of relationship and not of power, it would seem evident that wherever hierarchical structures have developed within the church, not only is power more easily abused, but quickly the ordained or set apart ones also accrue special titles, clothes, and places within worship quite out of character with the warnings of Jesus about becoming like the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 to 12. And so Zizioulas describes the presbyters seated around the bishop's throne, which is meant to symbolize the place of God. The bishop is meant to be understood as a living image of Christ. And of course, this understanding of bishops is not exclusive to the Orthodox Church, which Zizioulas is part of, but is found in similar fashion in Anglicanism and Roman Catholicism. I've attended the enthronement of bishops in the Anglican Church as a priest sitting in the specially set-aside seats for the clergy, all of us wearing special clothes to indicate our status in the church. My own ordination was much more extravagant than any wedding I've attended, and my ordination garb certainly would have outdone the bridal dress of many brides. How this expresses the humility and vulnerability of Jesus, or the servant nature of ministry and leadership conducted in his name, is beyond me. Sadly, many Pentecostals and evangelicals are following in similar fashion and treat clergy with a different honour and authority to non-clergy, even if the clergy don't evidence their role in their dress code. Likewise, there is also a disempowerment of the laity, the non-clergy, leaving them as mere spectators in the life of the church. As Wolf explains regarding the Trinity, within a community of perfect love, persons who have all the divine attributes, a notion of hierarchy and subordination is inconceivable. And so we can see that Wolf is offering us a different understanding of the Trinity to the one that Zizioulas offers us. If we find in Jesus of Nazareth the very structure of the mystery of the triune God, as Leonardo Boff says, then it is inconceivable that the sort of vulnerability expressed in the Incarnation, which is, after all, an expression of the nature of the Trinity, would then express itself in the church in some sort of institutionalized hierarchy. And so I'm suggesting very strongly that as Christians, our churches should not express any form of hierarchy, because I believe that we do not see any form of hierarchy in the Trinitarian nature of the God that we worship. Joseph Hellerman also writes at length regarding how the early church community understood themselves as a family. For the early Christians, the church was not an institutional organization with a mortgage payment. The church was a living organism with a mission. The early church did not even own their own buildings. They met in homes like family. Whilst we might struggle to accept the implications of the radical view of family Jesus espoused and was often lived out by the ancient Christians, nonetheless, the expectation was that relationships amongst God's children were to take priority over even blood ties. Further to this, and lived out by early Christians, material goods were not the possession of individuals, but were for the benefit of the family. Obviously, this sort of understanding of family and even possessions stand in stark contrast to the understanding held by most Western Christians. Not only would Hellerman suggest that the understanding of family held by the early church led directly to the whole Roman Empire ultimately bowing its knees to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, but sadly, the overemphasis on individualism found in our societies and also in our churches is making both individuals and our societies incredibly unhealthy. As Hellerman says, our freedoms, as intoxicating and exhilarating as they often are, have pushed us over the edge emotionally. We are reaping the consequences of decisions that were never meant to be made and lives that were never meant to be lived in isolation. Of course, we cannot go back to the way that the early church was, and we cannot likewise pretend that its understanding and practice of family and community were perfect. One only need read 1 Corinthians to be aware of the dysfunction and sin evident amongst the people of God in Corinth. But we can, like the early church, consider the Trinitarian implications of our faith and be willing, as the early church did, to live in a way that is potentially both more culturally contextual and yet at the same time deliberately countercultural. Whilst Tim Keller's book Centered Church contained much wisdom, I found it of concern when on one hand Keller states the gospel creates community. Community itself is one of the ways we do outreach and discipleship and even experience communion with God. And yet on the other hand, he would argue that at least half the number of people who gather for worship and teaching on Sunday should be involved in small groups to ensure that a church is community rather than a consumer centre. If community is of the essence of our ecclesiological understanding, and it certainly flows out of a Trinitarian understanding, then surely church must also be essentially a community. Our Sunday worship and any other structures put in place can only properly make sense in terms of how well they facilitate such community. If people are coming to such worship and are not being incorporated into a community, up to 50% by Keller's calculations in the models he discusses, then can we consider such people to truly be part of the church? Likewise, if small or mid-sized groups are the places where community is taking place, is there then a need for a larger gathering? Even if we can find a use for such a gathering, dare we call this larger gathering church? It's questions like this that need to be considered as we think through the ecclesiological praxis being offered by many regarding our current expressions of church. It's not surprising that amongst many emerging church practitioners, there has been a renewed emphasis on community and community development. Whether it be like Kellerman calling us to critique the more traditional patterns of church meeting that subtly but powerfully communicates the message that this impersonal once-a-week social environment is quintessentially what church is all about, in which we find our people seated side by side facing forward with little or no interpersonal interaction with persons to the left or the right, or as emerging church leaders attempt by being less concerned about the Sunday service, where the church meets, the style of the service, or even the structure, but that the kingdom of God is embodied in the life of the community. Just as in the early church, there has also been a renewed awareness of the church being a family and taking much more seriously what the implications of this might be for how members share their time and resources with one another. God bless you.